say checking marker, but I don't see. If it's just like a rod with nothing but flashes going
Right, right. Image structures. You're Justin.
Although
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. I see a good group of folks here. I know this is a very important issue to many people throughout the state, and we had a very good rally with the coalition this morning and got a preview of some of the speakers who will be speaking here today. So I think this is going to be a very informative committee hearing. My name is Fiona Ma, and I am chair of the Domestic Violence Select Committee. And I would like to thank my members, Assemblymember Dave Jones and Assemblywoman Norma Torres, who also took time out and I know care very deeply about this issue. Every year, thousands of adults and children seek refuge in the domestic violence shelters throughout the state of California. With stretched dollars, these limited shelters provide and assist victims in search for the most basic needs like food, shelter, and clothing. In July of this past year, Governor Schwarzenegger line item vetoed all of the state's funding to domestic violence shelters. The impacts of the drastic cuts that the governor has made are still coming to light. While many shelters are struggling to stay open, 6 have already closed. These shelters do not provide housing for the victims. They do not just provide housing for the victims. They provide an array of services which include individual and group counseling, legal services and advocacy, assistance in permanent housing and medical assistance, and many of these programs stay open through private donations, grants, and federal funding. By understanding what is working and how the financial situation can be improved, we can continue to help domestic violence shelters stay open and serve those who are in the direst need. The legislature has acted to provide a temporary fix to restore $16.3 million to the domestic violence shelters. This bill, SB 13X3, in which I co-authored with Senator Alquist, Senator Corbett, and Senator Leland Yee, is waiting to be voted on in the Senate on October 13th. This temporary solution will help the shelter keep their doors open for the people who most need their services. While this bill will help the current funding issue, this is only a temporary fix, and we do need to find a more permanent solution. Hopefully this hearing can shed light on how we can work together. Before moving on with the agenda, I would like to offer the other members here of the committee who perhaps would like to give some opening remarks. So, Assemblymember Jones.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the chairwoman for convening this hearing and for assembling such a great panel of witnesses. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to come before the committee and testify and share with us your experience and your thoughtful suggestions. And most of all, though, I want to thank the chairwoman for her leadership in providing this forum to make sure that we do everything we can to make sure the public understands that domestic violence is still a huge problem of epidemic proportion in California, and that while things are getting better, they're still bad. And I just want to note that in 2007, although there was a decrease in the number of murders committed as a result of intimate partner violence, a decrease from the year before when there were 134 murders. In 2007, there were 119. That's still 119 too many murders. And similarly, the statistics with regard to the number of individuals arrested for domestic violence has gotten better. In 2005, there were 45,000 such arrests. In 2006, 43,000. But that's still 43,000 too many arrests. And the great risk is that with the governor's veto of $16.3 million in funding for shelters and for the programs associated with the shelters, the outreach programs, the legal assistance programs, the prevention programs, that the progress that we have made over these past couple of decades will be reversed. And this progress is very fragile, and we are very vulnerable to losing the progress that we've made as a result of this funding. As the chairwoman noted, 6 shelters have closed. These are shelters in urban and rural areas across California that we can ill afford to lose. Because not only do we lose the shelter, but we lose the folks that are involved in that program who are doing outreach, who are doing prevention work, who are trying to prevent this activity from occurring in the first instance. Now, I'm very pleased that there is a bill sitting in the Senate that will provide us with the opportunity to restore at least the $16 million in funding. I support that bill as well. I think it's important to note that that bill would now be on the governor's desk, but for the shenanigans at 2 o'clock in the morning of our colleagues in the Senate Republican caucus who decided to hold that bill hostage to their demands that the Senate President get rid of an online tax preparation program called Ready Return at the behest of Intuit, which doesn't like the fact that Californians actually can have access to free tax preparation service. The notion that we would lose $16 million in replacement funding for domestic violence shelters because the Senate President was being leveraged on something that's totally unrelated and frankly is something that we shouldn't do is extraordinarily frustrating. And I hope that I make this point to you because if you were not aware of what happened, you should be aware of what's happened and should protest vehemently to those senators who stood in the way of the passage of that legislation. Our hope is that we'll get it done when the Senate resumes its deliberations in the next week or so, but it shouldn't have happened. With that, I am eager to hear the testimony. I want to apologize because I'm going to have to leave a little bit earlier than I would otherwise like. But again, I want to thank the chair for convening this important hearing.
Thank you very much. And this will be televised on the Cal channel. And I also sent out a Twitter message to folks if they want to log on to the website. They can also download it and we'll be able to replay it at a later time. So this all will be televised. And Assemblywoman Norma Torres.
Thank you, Fiona, and I also want to chime in and thank you for putting this, what I call a workshop, because it really is bringing people together to talk about a very, very important issue that threatens not only women across the state. Domestic violence is not just an issue that women are victims. It's the children that are involved that often turn out to be abusers. And let's not forget about the men who are also victims of domestic violence more often than we think. We see it more and more in teenagers. It's a problem that cuts across all ethnic and socioeconomic lines. It impacts everybody, but the community as a whole needs to stand behind domestic violence prevention. It is unfortunate that the governor and some of our colleagues have not taken the aggressive step to ensure that domestic violence shelters are fully funded. As a former 911 dispatcher, I can tell you that the #1 call that we received at the 911 center was a call relating to some type of domestic violence issue. The call that changed my life was a domestic violence type call that ultimately resulted in the murder of an 11-year-old child. We need to prevent that. And this is the first step towards ensuring that domestic violence funding is at the top of all of our priorities. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your service as a 911 dispatch operator. That is a very stressful job, and I know in 2008 there were about 170,000 calls from to public safety related to domestic violence. So folks like you and your former colleagues are very, very important to helping people stay safe. So thank you, Norma. Okay, so just a couple of ground rules. As we call up the speakers, we have allocated 5 minutes for each speaker so that we can ensure that everybody has time to speak and also give an opportunity for the public to also speak. I know that there is a sign-in sheet going around. After it goes around, my staff will put it up here closer to the end of the hearing so that everyone can come up and give their testimonial as well. And again, we thank you all for coming. We know that some of you in the audience may be suffering in silence and may come out and talk about your situation, or just may not, but just be here to support you or your family members who are actually suffering at this moment. So without further ado, I would like to call Michelle Coleman, Peace for Families, if you want to come up to the front. Victor Rivas Rivers, he is an actor, author, and activist who wrote a book, A Private Family Matter, and is also the national spokesperson for the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and Melody McGruder, a survivor. So who would like to begin? Michelle? Okay.
Is this
Thank
on?
you. Yes, and then we will give you like a 30-second card, just if you could wrap up after close to 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. Well, my name is Michelle Coleman, and I'm currently working at Peace for Families, which serves Placer County. It's up near Auburn. I've been doing this work around 8 years, and I'm honored to still be able to do this work. One thing I want to say before I start is that I'm going to talk a little bit about what actually happens in the shelter, what the shelter actually does for the survivors. But I want you to understand that there is no standard survivor, so there are no standard services. It's a case by case, and we try our best to meet the needs of the individual. So. Starting from how do they access us? Right now, the survivors will either call us on our crisis line. All of the agencies have crisis lines, or they will walk into one of our service centers and request help. This may happen in the middle of the day hours, or it may happen at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. As a matter of fact, we had one where we had to go and get someone just this past week at 4 o'clock in the morning. And unfortunately, they are sometimes bloodied and battered, but sometimes they are just broken emotionally and broken emotionally. So I will say that what happens is when we get the call, we immediately assure that they are in a safe place, that their surroundings are safe. We work to prioritize what is going on for them, what is the need right now, and how can we help them. It might be that we need to direct them to a safer place. It might be that we need to pick them up, or whatever the necessary at that point. An important component of that initial first conversation is safety planning. And one of the things that we do is work with them to plan their safe travels to wherever they're going to be. If we need them to go to a local police department, maybe if it's safer, we talk with them about where might the abuser be, where might the abuser look, and what can you do to get yourself safely to that place without encountering your abuser. If necessary, we will go and pick them up. Some of them have their own transportation, but what's important is that we identify what they need right now and to put them in a safe place. Once we get them to the shelter, which may be a lot of different ways. Some shelters have vans to pick people up. Some shelters actually will use cab services that they've made arrangements with, and sometimes the survivors have their own vehicles to get there. And once they get to the shelter, the priority is to really give them the opportunity to decompress, to really understand that you are in a safe place. You're here, we believe you, we're here to help you. You make the decisions. We are here to help you to meet the goals that you've set for yourself, not to give you our goals. So we spend a lot of time when they first get there just debriefing them, giving them an opportunity to feel safe and sound. Once they've gotten to that point, most of the shelters will allow the individuals to stay from 30 to 90 days. Depending on the different shelter. We provide the food and clothing and whatever they need along with their children. I'm sorry. I want to make sure I don't forget. It's very important that a large number of the victims that come to our shelters are bringing their children with them. When you're running from a dangerous situation, you don't leave behind your most precious possessions. So they're bringing their children with them to the shelter. Once they're in the shelter and we've begun to work with them and address what they need, they also have access to the legal services. We have people who help them to access temporary restraining orders. They might need child custody assistance, even down the road a little farther, some assistance with their actual divorce paperwork. And that is something that the shelter staff is capable of providing them with assistance. In addition, once we get a little past where they're calm enough and they are ready to begin to think about what does my future look like, and I think that's the real important part, because the goal is that when they do leave the shelter, that they are making a conscious decision about where they will be and not just having to go back to the abuser because they have no other idea about what to do. I'm sorry. And we also do job readiness. We do therapy for the children and for the mothers, and we do also. And a number of shelters also have the opportunity to even transition them into transitional housing where they can continue to build toward their future that they have outlined. Oh, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Should we just ask questions in between? One of the questions I have is, are these places safe if a woman brings her kids and is concerned about, the partner stalking her or, threatening her? Are these places safe for them, or is there places for them to go?
The shelters are safe for them, even though occasionally people find out. Most shelters have very good relationships with law enforcement. We teach the women how to sort of mitigate the chance that the abuser will find them. And if it's very dangerous and the abuser has found the location, the shelters have relationships with each other, and we will move that family to a safer location.
One thing I've noticed in my own district and in my travels across the state is that there are some shelters that are designed to serve particular communities and to be culturally sensitive to those communities. And so I'm thinking in particular of my sister's house here in Sacramento, which is not exclusive to the API community and serves anybody, but has a particular focus on Asian Pacific Islander domestic violence victims. And I'm also aware that there is I believe a new shelter in the Bay Area which has emerged to serve Muslim American victims of domestic violence. And I guess I am interested in this and trying to get a sense of whether the trend is towards more sort of culturally specific or community specific facilities, or in fact these two things will happen simultaneously. There'll be some that are focused on everybody, and then some that may take on a special mission and still be available to others. I'm just trying to get a sense of sort of what's happening in the landscape of shelters across the state.
I think it's the latter. I think that there are absolutely those groups who are doing specific shelters, but I don't think that we're ever going to see a time when all of the other shelters go away. Rather, I think you're seeing that the shelters that are becoming more culturally competent and better able to help all survivors that access their service. But there's always going to be, not only is there my sister's house, I know that there's Shalom Bayat that works more with the Jewish community. There are always going to be those that want to give a little extra to a different group, and that's wonderful. But I do think that the overall shelter population will be becoming more and more culturally competent, so that anyone who walks through the doors who needs the help will feel comfortable and will feel that all of their needs will be respected. Within the say the coalition or the shelter movement, for want of a better descriptor, I take it that there's no discouragement of culturally specific shelters, that there continues to be a space or place for that to occur as individual communities identify desire or need to do that and marshal the resources to do that. I think you're correct. There's no discouragement on that. Good. The one thing that you find in this movement is that everyone supports each other, because none of us can do it alone. Right. So we'll support anyone who wants to do that kind of work. Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michelle, for all your good work. And next is Victor Rivers, and we heard at the press conference a little bit about his story. And although domestic violence is seen as a woman's issue, it does have an impact on families. So thank you, Victor, for coming.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. I'm really here because I believe we should never forget what happens when there's no access to services. And the best way for me to exemplify that is to tell you a story of a woman and her children. This woman had come from another country, like so many other immigrant families, to pursue a better way of life here in America, only to find herself and her children terrorized by the oppression of domestic violence and child abuse that took place on a level of torture in their home. For 15 years, after carrying the burden of cooking, cleaning, childcare, and a full-time job at a factory, this woman also endured the physical, psychological, and spiritual woundings at the hands of her husband, until one day when she set off on foot to the local laundromat, pulling her family's many loads of laundry behind her in a cart. Well, that woman didn't return home that day. On the way there, she collapsed in the street, and she was rushed to a hospital where doctors determined that she was so close to death, they told her she was in God's hands. Now, fortunately, this woman did survive her collapse, but when she returned to the household, the domestic violence only increased. I'm also here because of a boy I know. This boy walked into his city's police department, and he took off all his clothes in front of a room full of police officers. And as the boy stood there naked, the officers were horrified that this boy's body was covered in bruises, welts, and burns. The boy told the police, "My father's doing this to me, to my siblings, and to my mom," and then he begged them. He said, "Please go to my house and arrest him and get him out of there." The police said there was nothing more that they could do, that it was a private family matter. The year was 1967, and that boy was me. And that woman who collapsed in the street, that was my mother. That happened right here in Hawthorne, California. That nightmare was my life. I don't remember my father ever hugging or kissing my mother, but what I do remember is him beating her, not only in rage, but with cold, methodical planning, not only with his hands and his feet, but with words and weapons too. And pregnancy didn't stop him. My mother was battered viciously while she was pregnant with my brother Robert. I was 6.5, almost 7 years old when I witnessed my father drop-kicking her in the stomach in her 9th month. I jumped on his back to pull him off, but it was too late. When my brother Robert was born, he was developmentally disabled to such a degree that he was immediately institutionalized. Tragically, my brother Robert did not live past the age of 9. Though I don't know half of what my mother went through, I can assure you that I heard and I saw plenty. Not only was that done to her, my siblings, to our pets, and to me. As a child, I was beaten, I was tied up, I was locked in closets, I was hammered, I was burned, to name a few. So now, why did my mom get herself and her kids the heck out of there? Well, because my mother didn't speak English, and she came from a country and a culture where women stayed with their men no matter what. But the main reason why my mom never left was because there was nowhere to go. There were no shelters, safe houses, counseling centers, community programs, no hotlines. There were no advocates. If only there had been. If only there had been those resources represented by many of the advocates who are sitting in this room today, saving lives like families like mine. Now, my encounter at the police station was not the first or the only time my family dealt with the authorities. We were left with the impression that the only way they would make an arrest was if he killed one of us or we killed him. And believe me, I came real close to doing that because that's how desperate we had become. But thankfully, in our days and in my neighborhood, guns were much harder to come by than they are currently. That's why we need to consider that the closing of shelters and cuts to domestic violence programs is having a ripple effect that will become a law enforcement and violent crime nightmare. Talk to experts in the field of juvenile justice, and you'll hear, in fact, that there's a significant number of boys between the ages of 12 and 18 who are incarcerated for murder are there because they killed their mom's abuser. But there's another reason why my mom never left, and that has to do with the reality that when a woman leaves, she and her children are often in the gravest danger of being killed by their abuser, even when they're holding that restraining order. The current statistic says that 47% of domestic violence homicides take place after she has left her abuser. That's why what you do to restore funding to our vital service programs, who are the heart of a community's coordinated community response in creating safety plans for those leaving violence, is to me a matter of life and death. So you see, the main reason why my mom never left was because she feared for our lives. So instead of my mother leaving my father, he abandoned her while she was pregnant and then kidnapped my siblings and me, taking us from Los Angeles, California, all the way to Miami, Florida. So without my mother in the household, things went from worse to horrendous, which eventually led to the first and only physical confrontation with my father that I started. That night, I ran away from home and from my father's terror for good. I was 15 years old. I spent a few days living on the street, and a high school classmate of mine spotted me, and he insisted that I go home and tell my story to his father. Now, what happened next is literally why I'm here today. If not for the intervention by a series of advocates who gave me shelter, guidance, and love, I wouldn't be alive today. My friend's father was one of those angels, and he also happened to be a lawyer. Through his help, I took my father to court where I was granted a restraining order. For the last 2.5 years of high school, I was taken in like the unofficial foster child of the school by several families within my community. And they took in a 6'2", 200-pound gang member, an angry, violent, homicidal, and suicidal kid, and they transformed me by the time that I graduated. I was president of my senior class. I got a 4-year football scholarship to Florida State University, where I played for the Seminoles, and I was also out with the Miami Dolphins for a couple of years. And finally, I'd like to briefly just address the money side of this equation that hit me 15 years ago or so when I was working on a film called Blood In, Blood Out that we shot in San Quentin Prison. When I walked around San Quentin, I looked at many of the prisoners and I said, there but for the grace of God. The overwhelming majority of individuals imprisoned in our country started out as victims or witnesses to family violence. The statistic for men in this country right now is currently 94% or higher. I got to tell you, I spent 5 weeks in San Quentin, in the prison population, not protected or guarded. And from my observations, rehabilitation in prison doesn't work. And that's why we got to spend those billions of dollars to better protect, better educate, and better equip individuals to better themselves in crisis. And that's what's called prevention. So I hope that my story represents what these advocates do. I'm the end result of the work that they do. And if you wonder if you can make a difference and make that tough investment, and I hope you'll remember my story, because that's what we can do for all Californians. I thank you for your time. Peace.
Thank you very much for being a role model for so many. Next speaker we have is Melanie Magruder. She is a survivor.
Have you ever fought in a war, spent time on a battlefield watching for the enemy but never knowing where they were coming from? Have you ever wondered where they were going to strike next, where the next bomb was going to come from, where the next slap or firing of guns was going to come from? For years I did. But you know, the funny thing is that I never fought in a war. I was never in the military service. You see, the war that I fought in was in my own home, and the enemy was my husband. My name is Melanie Magruder, and I'm a survivor of domestic violence. It began as a match made in heaven. He was Mr. Wonderful. Everybody loved him. And he was just well-known and popular, and he was just friendly and had a good job, and he took good care of us. And, you know, he was somebody that nobody could believe would do anything as horrific as the things that he did to me. Only I knew who the monster within was. He first revealed his bad side when we were at a party, and I was pregnant with our first child. He suddenly told me, go home, because he was kind of being friendly with some of the other women at the party, and he said, go home. And he emphasized his words by shoving me and pushing me and telling me, get out of here. I confronted him later, and he apologized, saying it would never happen, and I had made the mistake of believing him. Over time, my husband found it easier and easier to denigrate me. He slapped me, he kicked me, he beat me, he broke my bones, he choked me, he held me at gunpoint, he stalked me, and he raped me. His violence was always my fault. If I were just a better mom, a better wife, a better cook, if I was a better housekeeper, if I just dressed better, if I just looked better, if I just did the right thing, whatever that might be for the day, that he wouldn't have to do this to me, but he did. I left him often, taking our children and trying to keep us safe. But at that time, finances were always bad, and there were absolutely no support networks or any other type of agencies, just like with you. My mom told me I made my bed that I should lay in it. The police said, it's a family matter. We can't do anything to stop it. I began to believe that it was my fault and that I had nowhere to turn. One night when he was drinking and taunting me, he threw me across the room and my head hit a table. And I started bleeding from the back of my head. My daughter called the police, and my neighbor put me in the car, and they rushed me to the hospital, and they said, I heard them as I was laying on the gurney being wheeled into the emergency room, Code Blue, we're going to lose her if we don't stop the bleeding. And I knew somewhere within, because I was really kind of unconscious, and I knew somewhere within that they were talking about me, and I sat up in that gurney, and I said, Lord, if you let me live, I promise I'll never go back. And I never did go back. When I left the hospital, I took my children. I left our house. I left a car. I left every possession that we had. And I went out, we slept in our car in the beginning. And then friends let me have places to stay because, like I said, there were no support agencies at that time. We did never go back. We didn't ever go back. And as I got, as time went on, there were agencies started to form, and I went to a meeting where someone came and spoke about, domestic violence shelters and about domestic violence agencies. And I thought, wow, what a great thing to do. So I went back to the agency and I said, I want to help. What can I do? And they said, well, you have to take a training program and you have to, dedicate a certain amount of time to helping in whatever services you decide to do. So I started out doing temporary restraining orders after I took the training program, helping women to tell their story in a page and a half of what had happened in their life so that the judge would issue the restraining order. And from there, I went into education because I felt like educating was the most important thing to do. That if you're educated and people understand the effects of domestic violence on women and the families and their children and even the families, that would make a difference. So I've been doing that for 14 years, and now I've stepped up a notch, and I'm now I go into the jail. And I teach a class called Heart and Soul, which I teach the domestic violence component, talking about the healthy wheel, the cycle, and how it's a cycle, how the healthy wheel versus unhealthy relationship, power and control. And I also mentor women one-on-one. And I'm here to speak on behalf of these women because I have been able to reach these women, some of them, and I have been able to plant seeds that have made them want to go away from their lifestyles. And some of these women that are in prison right now are in prison because they were coerced into doing some of the crimes that they've done, like prostitution and robbing and writing checks and things like this. And because they've been told, if you don't, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill your children. I'm going to kill your mother. And if you try to leave me, I'm going to kill you. And they have been beaten, and they have been battered, and they have been bruised, and they believe it. And so they do it. And in their mental state, I can understand completely how they feel because I lived it and I was there. And because I lived it and I was there, I really am able to reach out to them and touch them and change their lives. But now with the budget cuts, my concern is that when they get out of jail, where are they going to go? They're going to have no other recourse but to go back to their abuser. So what's going to happen to them? Are they going to end up dead, or are they going to end up shooting him? Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Melanie, for sharing your story. And I also do want to recognize Tracy Stafford Copeland, who came out and spoke at the press conference earlier. And she was here last year and testified here in committee, just telling her story about the cycles of violence that she has in her fourth generation of batterers in her family, and how it's so important that we try to break these cycles of violence. And she is the Mrs. California USA in 2007, and she also is a great role model. So unfortunately she couldn't stay here today, but you did touch upon that. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming in your testimony today. So we heard a little bit about what shelters do and how important shelters are, especially in this day and age, and when there are no shelters, what that means to a community. Our next panelist will talk about funding, how the shelters are funded. We have Ellie Jones from Cal Lima and Karen Cooper from the Family Services of Tulare County. Norma, you want to sit over here? Are you okay?
Good afternoon. My name is Ellie Jones, and I'm the branch chief of the Victim Services Branch at California Emergency Management Agency. We are the single agency that provides domestic violence funding for California Shelter Program. We have approximately 85 programs that we fund at the present time. That was set forth in statute. The primary purpose of this funding is to maintain or expand services to domestic violence programs across the state. In addition, it seeks to serve or provide services to unserved or underserved populations. So with that in mind, the legislature in 2004 enacted Senate Bill 914, and that essentially identified 13 core service areas that the funding provided by Cal EMA was to cover those services in each of the 85 communities that we provide funding for. California has still got a very small proportion of local assistance from the general fund that is going towards the domestic violence program. We administer approximately $2.4 million. That money was reduced from 2.7 last year through the 10% reduction in general funds. However, in combination with the 3 other primary federal funding sources, we are able to provide almost $15 to $17 million annually to these 85 programs. We have 3 federal fund sources, the largest being our Victim of Crime Act funding. That money is direct services, or is used for direct services. There's approximately $7 to $9 million on any given year that is allocated for domestic violence services by Cal EMA. The second largest funding source that we have is the Family Violence Prevention Services Act funding. That is funding that is designated specifically for the domestic violence shelter program in California. Again, it is a federal fund source. Anywhere from $7 to $9 million, again, with that fund source, depends on what the allocation comes out of Congress. Lastly, we utilize the Violence Against Women Act funding. Now, this is the one fund source that tends to be in flux most of the time. We received $32 million last year for the state. This year, or excuse me, not 32, we had $11 million this year, but received $13 million in Recovery Act funding. So you can never tell what kind of funding we're going to be getting with this one. It is a categorical fund source, which means there's a certain percentage of this fund source that has to be identified for prosecution purposes, law enforcement purposes, victim services, and courts. So when that's all broken down, the amount available for the domestic violence program is very, very minimal in the grand scheme of things. And then lastly, we have the $2.4 million that we have for local assistance out of the general fund. The funding that is provided is on an annual basis. We do it through grant award agreements. We are not able to release the funds to the domestic violence shelter program until the Budget Act is signed, and we have authority to do so. We do have a process in place at Cal EMA that upon receipt of the invoice for services, we try and refund that money back to the programs within 45 days. So we do have a very quick turnaround for payment of the services. We have worked with all of these programs, both in the domestic violence and sexual assault areas, over the last couple of years to do what we can to stabilize their funding. And in this current year, we did receive $1.7 million, or set aside $1.7 million of the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act funds for domestic violence services. That was prior to the current action that was taken by the administration to reduce some of this funding. However, that 1.7 did go to domestic violence, and it was used for core outreach services. So, you know, we've had that. We've been able to successfully identify some funding to assist one of the shelters that you had identified earlier as closing, so that we can keep their doors open at least through June, and have made agreements with the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence and some of our other federal funders to keep them apprised of what's happening in California, to see if there's any other funds available, and to try and get that money out to the field as quickly as possible. So with that, I'll take questions.
And I'm assuming there's a waiting list.
There's always a waiting list, yeah. You can never have enough money for these types of services.
Right. Do you see like an increase in certain categories where if we had more money, we would be able to fund certain programs?
If we receive federal funding, that funding tends to be targeted. As I said earlier, the majority of it's categorical. So any type of an increase would have to be disseminated in accordance with the rules and regulations for receipt of those funds. The VOCA funding tends to be the most the broadest, because it can be used for all services, and that it would include women and children and other victims of violent crimes. In that, we're anticipating that there will be some positive action on Capitol Hill this year that will increase the cap, that will then result in additional funds coming down to California. But until that occurs, we're going forward with kind of a stabilization mode and trying to see what we can do at least to keep the baseline funding for the domestic violence program as stable as possible.
And I did have an opportunity to see Congresswoman Lucille Roybal Allard last night down at the Sukasa event down in Lakewood, and she is working on the SAFE Act in Congress that would allow women who are working an opportunity to take the time off if they're a victim of domestic violence, and also to help them during the transition time. So if anyone wants to get involved at the federal level, Lucille Roybal Allard has her SAFE Act that she is trying to get passed. So thank you very much for your testimony. And Karen Cooper.
Thank you. My name is Karen Cooper, and I have been involved in the domestic violence movement for over 30 years, the last 20 of which as the director of a service-providing domestic violence agency. And I'll just to summarize the report that Ellie just gave to you, the 94 shelters that they fund, after you name all of those different sources, that amounts to somewhere between $155,000 and $175,000 per shelter. So it's not a huge amount, but it's a nice amount. And there were 3 different funding sources that were geared toward our mission, because people in our kind of work, we care about what is the mission of the money? What is it intended to accomplish? Why is it there? And there were 3 sources. There was the money that came through CalEMA, the state money that came through the Department of Public Health, and then the marriage license fees we receive at the local level. And those funds were there to help domestic violence funding victims, to prevent domestic violence, and to hold batters accountable. And now there are 2. And with the loss of one of those 3 pillars, we continue to do what we have always done, which is to go look for other pools to swim in. And those pools are places where our allies are, our friends are, and for example, the first place that many of us go is to the homeless pool. And we then compete with other homeless agencies for funds. And we no longer refer to our clients as domestic violence victims, we refer to them as homeless families. And we were very lucky, and many of us do receive some HUD money, some FESG money, some FEMA, EFSP money, or some EHAP money, at least we used to, until that also was blue-lined by the governor a year ago, which was very devastating to many shelters. But the problem with swimming in this pool is that it's competitive, and not everybody can compete in every county. Then we go to swim in the child and families pool. And when we're there, we're looking and competing with many, many family and children's programs that are looking for funding from First Five or CAPIT or Preserving Safe and Stable Families or the Mental Health Services Act or Children's Trust Funds. And again, it's year to year, it's competitive, and who are we focusing on? Children, which is very, very important, but we really have to downplay our focus on domestic violence victims in order to swim in this pool. And then we go and we swim in the county pool for CalWorks or for child welfare funds. And we begin to talk about getting people jobs and overcoming job problems, which becomes the new mission. And then we're looking to the private funding pool and having our own bake sales and our own dances and selling everything you can think of and writing to foundations and competing with all the other nonprofits to do the same. And then we're also, of course, looking to the in-kind pool for volunteers and for pro bono work. And those are all our various sources of funding. And we're happy that when we get them, the problem is that each time we expand a pool, we expand another network, we have new databases, we have separate reports, we have separate outcomes, we have to create whole new systems, so that we'll have 6 or 7 little systems going in order to keep one shelter-based program together. And we're using 6 sets of languages to satisfy each of those different funding sources. So that's why our core funding is so important, because it enables us to be true to our mission and say we're here to work with victims of domestic violence and their families to prevent domestic violence and to hold batters accountable. And we need that third leg, that state funding back, to have some basic core funding. Thank you.
Thank you very much for putting this problem in perspective. Yes, Ms. Torres.
As also the chair of Housing and Community Development, housing, and we can talk about transitional housing. What are your obstacles in finding a safe place for families to move into?
Well, you know, transitional housing is something that is very close to my heart because I think it has offered tremendous opportunities, and we have been, my agency has successfully applied for EHAB-CD funding twice, and we now own 7 apartments that are transitional units, and we rent about 10 more, which has been a night and day difference from where we were 5 years ago when we had people going back into violent situations who didn't want to simply because they couldn't find affordable housing. The biggest obstacle for most providers, there's a couple of them. One of them has surely been the lack of affordable housing in our state, which everyone is very familiar with. And the other has been in terms of developing transitional housing if it's owned, that you have to have a lot of expertise, and you have to be able to wait a year. You know, you have to be able to apply for funding. It may not actually come down in a check for over a year. Find someone who wants to rent or build for you under those circumstances. This year, everything was held up even longer because of the freeze on the funds, and so for many small nonprofits, that's very daunting to enter into those kind of contracts without assurances of whether or not you're actually going to be paid or when you're going to be paid. But it is a good partnership. We work closely with Housing and Community Development, with our homeless provider, with our continuums of care in our counties. It is an important resource for families that are escaping violent homes, and we want to continue to do that. But it's a challenge.
I think one of the biggest crises is not receiving that initial call for help, but an hour or two later, when the financial crisis sets in the victim's mind, they begin to think, well, the police department just arrested the only means of feeding my children or keeping a roof over their heads. And how do we deal with that?
That's right.
Are there enough Section 8 vouchers for them?
Having some source of transitional housing is really a tremendous boon. It's really a critical help for exactly what you're talking about, because people can do the math and they figure out very quickly, you know, I'm not going to make it. Yeah. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Our next panel will talk about how the shelters are affected by the recent budget. Nico Johnson, Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Coalition of Grass Valley. Nicole Shellcroft, Domestic Violence Center of Santa Clarita Valley. And Tina Figueroa, Madera County Action, Martha Diaz Shelter. Thank you.
Again, I looked and I saw the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter. Good afternoon. I am Nico Johnson from the Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault Coalition in Grass Valley. I would like to sincerely thank you for supporting the legislation to reinstate the domestic violence shelter funding. And in light of the loss of the funding to our shelter in Grass Valley, I could share statistics on how many bed nights we have lost or people we have sheltered in the last year and what that loss in funding has meant to us. However, I'd like to take this opportunity to give a voice to 3 women who represent our mothers and our daughters, our sisters and our neighbors and our friends, on how their lives have been impacted by the closing of our shelter. The question that Caroline asked was, then what? Caroline had been thinking about leaving her abusive husband for many months, but with 3 young children and his threat that if she should ever try to leave, he would kill her, she knew that her efforts for herself and her children to be safe needed to be well thought out and well planned. She stated more than once, if I leave for good. I get one chance. Caroline had been secretly attending women's support group. She'd gained strength and she was gaining support, preparing herself to flee, steeling herself for a battle in the courtroom over her children, knowing getting law enforcement involved would only enrage him, not willing to put friends and family at risk. Caroline knew her biggest hurdle was safe housing. However, when that crucial moment came, she called our agency for shelter, and she found out that we had to suspend services due to lack of funding. All we could offer her were 2 or 3 nights in a motel. Then what was her response? When she was ready, the services were not available. Caroline and her children are buying their time, enduring the abuse, for her only other option was homelessness. Leanne has lived in our community for over 20 years, and while the relationship with her partner had been physically and verbally abusive for many years, she had not been pushed from a moving car as she had that Friday night. She called our agency's crisis line, needing a place to stay for the night until she could get to Los Angeles to safety and to her family. The crisis line advocate began making calls to hotels and motels. And this is currently our option for safe housing with our shelter being closed. Because it was the weekend of a number of very popular community events, there was not one room in the community for Leanne to stay in to rest and recover. The shelters in our neighboring counties were all full, and the safest place for her to go was the 24-hour pharmacy or the waiting room at the hospital's emergency room. She spent the night in the ER's cafeteria because there was 24-hour security there. She then spent the next day at the library, where the staff was kind enough to let her use the phone to talk with our advocate. We were then able to make arrangements for her to get out of the area and to safety. And lastly, Sandy and her son did stay at our women's shelter when we were providing services. She had come due to an intervention by her son's doctor. When her newborn son was showing signs of failure to thrive, the pediatrician began asking questions about what was going on in the home. It was the first time Sandy had ever told anyone about the verbal and physical assaults that she suffered at the hands of her partner. Even when I'm holding the baby, he screams and yells and threatens me, she wept. The doctor explained that her child was responding to the abuse. He did not cry. He was nearly silent, and he was losing weight when an infant should be growing his fastest. Realizing her child's life was in danger, Sandy entered the women's shelter. After 3 weeks of safe, stable, supportive environment, Sandy's son began to gain weight. He began to cry, as babies do. And not only was it a relief to his mother, it was pure joy. Do shelters for domestic violence victims save lives? I believe that they do. Is the state of California in an economic crisis? I believe that we are. Agencies across the state were so drastically and suddenly cut, we did not have the opportunity to diversify or make adjustments. And we are asking for the opportunity to help save lives through funding programs that serve our communities well. We can end domestic violence through supporting Caroline, Leanne, and Sandy, and the thousands of other people across our state who suffer from domestic violence. Together, we can stand up and speak out against the oppression of domestic violence. We can speak for those who cannot. Thank you.
My name is Nicole Shellcroft, Executive Director of the Domestic Violence Center of the Santa Clarita Valley, a domestic violence agency in northern Los Angeles County. I would like to thank the committee for inviting me here today. I am here representing the 4 women who have lost their lives due to domestic violence in my community. We have seen 4 domestic violence deaths in this community in the last 5 months. The elimination of the entire budget for California's domestic violence programs was a devastating blow to our center and our community. We lost nearly half of our annual budget, and the impact was an immediate reduction of staff and services to our community. Our state and county mandate for 24-hour coverage has not changed, and we are now challenged to maintain the same capacity of service provision with a skeleton staff of 6, 4 of which are part-time. Our center lost its outreach center home of 26 years, and 5 days ago we moved into a very small office with community support. A community member stepped up and allowed us to move into a small space for a really low monthly fee, so we were very, very lucky. But among the tragedies of this move is the loss of accessibility and familiarity to our center location. On many occasions, victims of domestic violence have knocked on our outreach center door with bags in one hand and children in the other, asking for help to find shelter. Clients who come to us in this manner have not reached out by phone. They knew where we were through word of mouth and came when they needed emergency services. On the day of our move, 2 new walk-in clients came to our door asking for help. The day after our move, an old client had come to our center to attend our regularly scheduled support group and found our doors closed. The new office space has left us without adequate space to conduct our 4 weekly support group sessions, and we must rely on community agencies for support. This puts our clients' confidentiality and safety at risk. We are no longer able to accept any new clients for a support group or individual counseling due to lack of sufficient space and the loss of our clinical director. In the last week, we have turned away 4 people referred to support group. And support group is where the magic happens. It is a place where victims of domestic violence come together and share with each other their experiences and learn crucial life lessons and skills. We see so much growth, and through their experiences in support group, our clients become strong, confident survivors. The Domestic Violence Center is the only agency in our community providing comprehensive DV services. And last year, we served over 1,000 victims through our hotline, outreach center, and emergency shelter. And unfortunately, our numbers continue to rise. As the center's director, I think about every client who's come through our doors and the horrific stories of abuse. For many of us, our home is a place of refuge from the world, from work, from stress. It is a place that brings comfort and safety. Families suffering at the hands of a violent perpetrator do not have this experience of a home. For many victims and their children, the home is a terrifying place. And those who walk through our doors have suffered through broken bones, beatings, strangulation, food deprivation, arson, torture, genital mutilation, and unspeakable sexual violence. Their children witness the violence perpetrated against them and are often victims to abuse and violence themselves. Our clients that I know personally have been thrown down flights of stairs, have had all of their teeth knocked out, have been beaten unconscious, have been a victim to violent physical attacks during pregnancy, as well as attempted murder. Recently, we had a client in our shelter who survived multiple stab wounds to the face, neck, back, and stomach. And we were able to provide her shelter and sanctuary until law enforcement arrested the perpetrator. Victims seek our services to escape incredible violence aimed at them and their children. Today, our outreach center is closed because I'm here giving testimony today. There is only one staff, a part-time shelter advocate working today to cover the hotline, our shelter clients' needs, and any emergency services that may be needed. The hotline calls for emergency shelter have not stopped just because our funding has, and it has even harder to find space for victims. When I receive a hotline call in the middle of the night, what do I say when I have called for bed space and there isn't any? It's a heartbreaking experience. Our shelters work to not only save lives, we work to prevent domestic violence from occurring. Our agencies provide education and outreach programs directed at teens and youth, and with the rise of teen dating violence, it is critical that prevention services continue. As a result of the funding elimination, our agency has had to suspend our teen program called Hurt No More. Our support group was thriving and growing, and now it is lost for the community. This elimination of funding has set back the services for victims of domestic violence that will be felt for many years, and it sends the message that victims often hear from their abusers, that you are alone. Thank you for your time.
Good afternoon. My name is Tina Figueroa. I am the Program Manager for the Victim Services Department in Madera County. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to speak here today. Community Action Partnership of Madera County opened the first battered women's shelter in Madera in 1989. The shelter was respectfully named after Martha Diaz. Martha was a young mom expecting her second child when she was killed in the presence of her son by an ex-boyfriend. Martha's brother-in-law was also killed while trying to protect her. At the time that she was murdered, there was no battered women's shelter in Madera County. The closest safe shelter was 27 miles south. Community Action Partnership of Madera County was proud to be the first agency to open a battered women's shelter in Madera County. At the time, the Martha Diaz shelter had 14 beds and 4 employees, rotating schedules to operate the shelter successfully. Through the years, the demand for our shelter services increased. We eventually expanded to 24 beds and 11 employees. Each year for the past 5 years, we've sheltered over 100 women and children consistently for 5 years. In the 2008-2009 fiscal year, we provided over 7,016 intervention services in Madera County for victims of domestic violence. On October 8, 2009, we received notice that the Emergency Housing Assistance Program canceled $52,177 that we were expecting to receive to provide extended lengths of stay for victims residing in our shelter. On August 3, 2009, we were notified that the governor canceled $207,222 that we were expecting to receive just to operate the emergency shelter. That is a total loss of $259,399 that forced us to close our shelter after 20 years of operation. We spent August 3rd through August 7th relocating victims that were residing in our shelter. Most of the victims had open cases in Madera County. None of them had transportation. Madera is a small rural county located 27 miles north of Fresno, where some of our victims were sent to reside. This created a barrier for those that had cases in Madera. They were not able to attend court like they wanted to and speak on their own behalf. Not only were they forced to relocate to another county, but their children were forced to attend new schools. One of the victims that relocated to Fresno spent 2 weeks trying to find a doctor that would accept Medi-Cal for her young daughter that had asthma. She needed an inhaler. The offender used this to his advantage in a custody dispute. These victims have already suffered from abuse, and now they're suffering further from a system that has inflicted further hardship. After we closed our Martha Diaz shelter, we notified 4 employees that we were no longer able to afford their salaries. To this date, we have turned away 21 victims that needed a safe place to stay. The only option in our county is the rescue mission. The rescue mission is not a protected shelter for victims, and their mission is not to protect victims. They have no safety standards, they do not collect restraining orders, and they do not do, their mission is just not to protect victims. I've spent a lot of time turning away women that really needed a place to stay while they're holding their children in their hands. And it reminded me of Martha Diaz. Martha's was in the same position that they're in, with no safe place to go. And the result was a 3-year-old that stayed with no mom, and her brother-in-law that left behind 3 children and a wife. It took 20 years to get to the level where we'd have safe housing, and it took 1 signature to take it all away. And we're just asking for all of the support that we can get from you today. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story. I actually got involved in domestic violence back in 2000 when a young woman, Claire Joyce Timpungo, in San Francisco was brutally murdered in front of her 2 young children. And how many stories do we have to hear before we actually can end this and allow people to feel safe? So I'm sorry that your shelter had to close, and hopefully the governor will see fit to restore the funding so that we can open the Martha Diaz Clinic again, shelter. So thank you. Okay, our next panelists are going to talk about the ramifications of the discontinuance of the funding. Mike Harold, Western Center on Law and Poverty; Frank Marquez, Women Haven, Inc., and Emberly Cross of the Cooperative Restraining Order Clinic.
Assemblymember Ma, thank you very much for holding this very important hearing. And actually on your last point about hoping that the governor will restore the funding, I did want to update the committee in the hearing today that Western Center and other advocates are in the process of litigating the line item vetoes of the domestic violence funding, the funding for AIDS, for clinics, for healthcare clinics, and many other programs that were the subject of the veto. As you may be aware, the Court of Appeals has accepted our petition for a hearing on overturning the governor's line item vetoes. On an expedited basis, and in fact, over the last 4 weeks, the attorneys for us and our other counsel and the attorneys for the Attorney General's office have been busy writing briefs back and forth to the First Court of Appeals in Los Angeles, and we expect there to be a hearing date announced very shortly. Now, no promises. No one ever knows what a court of law is going to do, and we certainly wouldn't want to speculate. But we do take some, interest, I think, in the fact that the court seems to be moving very quickly in reviewing this matter, and hopefully is going to at least give us an answer on what the court's view of the line item veto issue is. And, obviously, we would not have brought the case if we didn't feel like we had good reason. So we're hopeful that will get resolved in our favor, but in the meantime, I did want to talk very briefly about some of the other things that occurred in the budget this year that also are going to have an impact on domestic violence shelters and most particularly the families who need these services. And Assemblymember Torres, I did want to thank you for bringing up the EHAP issue. Western Center has long been the proponent of keeping those funds in that program. It is the beauty of the EHAP funds is its flexibility. You can use it on almost anything, and many funding sources are limited, but you can pay for insurance, you can pay for rent, you can pay for utilities, you can pay for salaries. A lot of funding sources do not provide the flexibility that EHAP has, and it's had a devastating impact both for domestic violence and in the emergency homeless shelter situation. The other thing I wanted to talk about today quickly is the CalWORKS program. Aside from the shelter networks who do an amazing job out there in the field, CalWORKS really is the core program that we have that allows families to escape domestic violence. CalWORKS provides cash assistance, child care, counseling, and work opportunities for families, helping them to move out of domestic violence and into a secure environment. And let me just underscore that from the statistics that we have seen over the years, I mean, personally, when I meet CalWORKS recipients, it doesn't take long. Almost every single family I've met will tell you about a domestic violence situation. But the data tells us that at least 30 to 40% of all new applicants who come in the door are in a current domestic violence situation when they come into the CalWORKS program. And more than 50%, closer to 60, have been in a domestic violence situation in the past. So this is very much a core program, or the core program that many survivors rely on in order to be able to escape violence. But all is not well with that program. Now, in AB 4X4 this summer, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, we exempted more families from doing welfare to work activities. From a child development standpoint, that's probably all right. But it also cuts $375 million from the county budgets, the CalWORKS budgets, that we can use to provide counseling and services, child care, and other services that help domestic violence recipients get out of harm's way. The counties obviously are going to be cutting back. They're going to use these exemptions to reduce the amount of services and counseling and child care that's going to be available for families. There's also flexibility in the county's ability to use CalWORKS mental health and substance abuse funds. Now, counties still have to use those within prescribed ways, but it may mean that we're going to see less mental health and substance abuse funds available out in the counties. And I think what it means really is that the welfare departments are likely to be providing less services to domestic violence survivors, and the counties are likely to provide less contracts to the domestic violence providers in the field. So I think we're going to see them get hit on both things, and I did see that sign. I did want to just make note, though, that the worst is really ahead. AB 4X unfortunately made some substantial changes to the CalWORKS program. It's going to really, in the future, cut grants almost in half for families who are not meeting work requirements. This is going to drive, we think, domestic violence survivors back into harm's way. We think that's really the wrong way that we should be going. We hope that the legislature will revisit that. And then we also know that we have existing pressures coming forward. The governor tried to eliminate CalWORKS funding this year. Next year, we know the ARA stimulus funds for CalWORKS and TANF are going away. The governor undoubtedly will be trying to cut those grants, and that's bad news for those families also. I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Frank?
Thank you, Assemblywoman Fiona Ma, members of the committee. Thank you for an opportunity to be here and express a little bit about what goes on in our community and in our shelter services. Center for Family Solutions, also known as Women Haven Inc., was the second shelter in the state of California that was founded in 1977. We are operating out of Imperial County, and we have been struggling as well with the funding issue. Imperial County, as you may know, is the second county, the second poorest county in the state of California. We're deep south, to the south of Imperial County is Mexico, and to the east is the borderline to Arizona. Our economic crisis, the national economic crisis, has made a big impact in our region. Our numbers have been increasing as far as domestic violence services. Our staff members, of course, have been overwhelmed because of this impact. We have gone from 46 staff members at one time down to 19 at this point. We have also been forced to reduce our operational space to provide advocacy services and intervention to our clients from a 5,000 square foot to down to a 2,800 square foot space. We're crunched together, we're overlapping with each other, and trying to keep the services up for our people. Our management staff has been forced pretty much to take on double shifts, coming back in at 10 o'clock at night and be able to work the shelter and be able to take on call the remaining of the nights. So this has become a challenge. It has become a situation that is tiresome for them, and it also they have become a little bit more irritable in the pressures that they're undergoing. Last year, the fiscal year 2008-2009, we served 5,600 clients in our community. Our unemployment rates do not help to this matter. Our unemployment rate has gone up to 32% as of July of this year, and it fluctuates throughout the year. Our economic situation is not the greatest, therefore our demands for domestic abuse services is very, very crucial that we have a service. We are the only agency in the county that provides comprehensive services to these clients. So we would like to have the support of this committee in restoring this funding, because it makes a difference in the lives of these children, which should be a priority in our list, and priority of providing a safe and nonviolent environment to the women, children, and men that are victims of domestic abuse. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And Emberly Cross.
Good afternoon. As everyone in this room is aware, domestic violence survivors and their children need a whole variety of services to assist them in escaping the violence. When the state's funding for domestic violence programs was cut on July 28th, many other services for survivors were jeopardized, in addition to the very crucial emergency shelter services. In San Francisco, our domestic violence shelters subcontracted out some of their Department of Public Health monies to other domestic violence service providers to help ensure that wraparound service for survivors. For example, the Asian Women's Shelter subcontracted out to Donaldina Cameron House, an agency which provides community-based domestic violence counseling and advocacy in San Francisco's Chinatown community. The loss of this funding to Cameron House is expected to result in a 40% reduction in their domestic violence case management services. That includes language translation, interpretation services, accompanying their clients to court hearings, immigration appointments, appointments with other social service agencies. Cameron House expects that they're going to have to turn away approximately 55 survivors of domestic violence this year due to this loss of funding. The Riley Center of St. Vincent de Paul Society in San Francisco operates both an emergency shelter and a transitional housing program. You may have seen the recent New York Times article that highlighted the Riley Center and pointed out that they're losing 6 of their beds as a result of the funding loss. They subcontracted $25,000 of their Department of Public Health monies to my agency, the Cooperative Restraining Order Clinic. As our name suggests, we assist survivors of domestic violence in obtaining restraining orders against their abusers. In the 2008-2009 fiscal year, we provided services to 1,038 domestic violence survivors, an increase of 13% over the prior year. We also experienced a 12% increase in the number of non-English speaking survivors seeking our services during that past year. We assisted clients in Spanish, Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Japanese, Korean, Palestinian, Arabic, and Portuguese, among other languages. The subcontract that we had from the Riley Center paid for our interpreters for our non-English speaking clients. The entire annual budget for our agencies is a little bit less than $250,000, so this loss in funding represents 10% cut to our services, and I don't know which 10% of my victims to turn away who are seeking services from us. Survivors need to have the option of accessing immediate legal services. For many survivors, a restraining order is the first step to safety. Although we don't see these messages in the media and the popular culture, it has been well documented that restraining orders can keep domestic violence survivors and their children safe. They can stop violence. A 2003 article in the Journal of the American Medical Association concluded that 70% of victims who obtained a restraining order experienced a substantial and significant decrease in the risk of physical abuse. Restraining orders also can prevent batterers from buying firearms. Gun shop owners are required to run the names of potential buyers through databases to determine if, among other things, there's a restraining order against them which would prohibit their purchase of a firearm. In the United States in 2004, approximately 10,000 applications for firearms purchases were turned down because the potential buyers were restrained by active protective orders. In California alone in 2004, over 200 gun license applications were denied because the applicant had an active restraining order in the system. I just received last night the results of a study regarding restraining orders that was done in Kentucky that's being presented to the National Institute of Justice this month. It looked at the effectiveness of restraining orders, the enforcement of restraining orders when they are violated, and the costs and the cost savings of restraining orders. The study also compared these factors between urban and rural areas in the state. I'll be honest, I didn't have time to read the entire 180-page study last night or this morning, but as I scanned it, two of the authors' conclusions did stand out to me. The first was that in the first 6 months after a victim received a restraining order, half of them were not violated. That means half of them were, but half of them were not violated, and for those that were, the abuse did decrease significantly over time. A second conclusion that jumped right off the page at me was that restraining orders save the state of Kentucky an estimated $85 million per year. I do not know the population of the state of Kentucky. I did not have time to look that up this morning, but I do know that it is significantly smaller than the population of the state of California. And if restraining orders save the state of Kentucky $85 million per year, I shudder to think how much it's going to cost the state of California to have eliminated state funding for agencies which provide this vital service. I want to thank you for the opportunity for all of us to be here to talk with you about this important issue today, and I want to thank you, Assemblywoman Ma, for your leadership on this issue.
Thank you very much. And our next panelist is Where Do We Go From Here? Tara Shabazz is the Executive Director for the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence. Thank you, Tara, for all of your help. Every October, they take the leadership role in organizing the press conference and help us with the hearings here today. And Sue Else,
Good job.
President, National Network to End Domestic Violence. Thank you, ladies.
Great, thank you. Wow, I just need to collect myself for a moment. On behalf of the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, I would like to thank you, Chairwoman Ma, and well, you're the only member left of the committee, but as well as the rest of the committee, the folks on the Select Committee on Domestic Violence for their opportunity to speak here today. As you stated, I'm joined here by Sue Else, the President of the National Network to End Domestic Violence, who will later provide us with a national perspective on this very important issue. The California Partnership to End Domestic Violence is California's federally recognized state domestic violence coalition, which provides statewide leadership and advocacy for California's domestic violence advocates and the victims and survivors they serve. We are a statewide membership-based coalition with a 30-year history, providing a unified voice for over 200 California organizations and individuals working to end domestic violence at the local, state, and national levels. Over the past few months, we have been working tirelessly with advocates across the state and the nation to assist programs in adjusting to the loss of state funding and also to assess the impact that state funding cuts would have on their organizations, the survivors and the children they serve, and the wider community. We've heard some of that impact here today, but it's still too soon to tell what the ultimate impact will be. But what we do know is that one shelter closure is one too many. One bed reduction is one too many. One survivor in need turned away for lack of resources is one too many. Those of us who work with domestic violence survivors have long known that shelters play a pivotal role in saving the lives of victims and their children. In 1994, the state legislature identified domestic violence as an urgent issue facing women and communities and established the Battered Women's Shelter Protection Act. Since then, domestic violence shelters have evolved and transformed from an informal network of volunteers sheltering women in their homes to a statewide system of comprehensive advocacy and service organizations. Domestic violence shelter-based organizations are additionally public safety agencies and most often held to more rigorous standards than other social service agencies to ensure the safety and confidentiality of their clients. Not all domestic violence victims turn to shelter, nor does every shelter have the capacity or resources to serve the diverse needs of all victims. Victims come into contact with various public and private agencies at different stages of their lives. We know that tens and thousands of victims turn to shelter when there is no other place to go. According to a study conducted by the Blue Shield of California Foundation, on average, more than 15,000 people are served by state-funded domestic violence shelters each year. But tragically, more than 7,000 victims per year are turned away throughout the state. We also know from the Blue Shield data that the majority of these victims were in serious crisis at the time they sought shelter. Many reported grave threats to their physical safety. 65% of those victims stated a weapon had been used against them. Victims who turned to state-funded domestic violence programs were more likely to have a weapon used against them than those reported to law enforcement data. This weapon-related data suggests that victims served by state-funded domestic violence shelters may be doing so in part because they are facing threats of serious physical harm. Shelter-seeking victims also report lack of financial resources. This group is more likely to have an income at or below $35,000 than the general population. Over the past 30 years, the California legislature has worked with our coalition and its members' programs to enact legislation that has been crucial to our response to domestic violence by supporting domestic violence services and enacting changes to penal codes and family laws. These legislative initiatives have allowed for increased intervention and prevention services and options for survivors of domestic violence and their families in California. The elimination of state funding to domestic violence shelters could ultimately take us back 30 years to a time before victims had access to comprehensive and fully confidential and secure services they have today. Ensuring the passage of SB 13X3 is not the solution, but it is a step in the right direction. And actually, after hearing Senator Steinberg said, not only do we want to reinstate this funding, but we need to ensure that there's continued funding and an increased funding for domestic violence shelter services, intervention, and prevention. So we will be looking to you, our champions on this issue of domestic violence, to stand with us and work with us to ensure the ongoing state funding is secured and increased. We will do our part at the local and state and national levels, but we are counting on your support and leadership in the legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. And you did touch a little bit on the lack of financial resources, and I just wanted to recognize one of my colleagues, Assemblymember Jim Bell, who is working also very hard on trying to level the playing field for those that don't have the resources to fight for custody, custody battles in the court. So just wanted to give a shout out to him for all he's been doing as well in this area. So thank you. And Sue?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. The National Network to End Domestic Violence is an advocacy membership program based in Washington, D.C. We represent the 56 state and territorial coalitions against domestic violence, which in turn represent more than 2,000 local domestic violence programs. Ultimately, we serve millions of domestic violence survivors who turn to service providers to help them live safer lives. We work diligently to be the voice of domestic violence victims on Capitol Hill. Before coming to the National Network, I ran a domestic violence program in Kansas City, Missouri, and I know firsthand how budget cuts can impact the safety of victims. I am here because domestic violence experts across the nation are shocked and appalled that the governor would eliminate all domestic violence funding in California's budget. We have been working with a number of states across the country who have seen some funding reductions, but nothing compares to the extreme case in California. I cannot overstate how dire the situation is for victims and victim service providers. The economy is exacerbating domestic violence. The demand for services is going up while funding is going down, a deadly combination for those in abusive relationships. We have noticed an alarming trend of horrific mass killings related to domestic violence. In fact, during February and April of 2009, there were 12 mass murders in the United States. In 11 of the 12, the murderer had a history of perpetrating domestic abuse, or the murder was directly related to domestic violence. 68 people were murdered, including 20 children. Since May, there have been multiple reports of familicide committed by individuals with a history of perpetrating domestic violence. We are hearing from advocates all across the country that now an increasing number of victims are coming forward for help. In fact, 3 out of 4 domestic violence shelters reported an uptick in women seeking assistance since September 2008. And according to the National Center for Victims of Crime, 92% of victim service providers have seen an increased demand in this last year. At the same time, however, there are fewer resources to help victims. Corporate and individual giving is shrinking as companies and individuals have been tightening their belts. This is having a devastating effect on survivors of abuse. The scary reality is that there was an unconscionable gap between demand for services and available resources before the economic crisis began. The National Network's 2008 one-day census found that service providers helped more than 60,000 victims, including more than 4,000 in California, in one day alone. This one-day snapshot also revealed that across the country, nearly 9,000 requests for services were unmet because programs lacked the resources that they need. In California, over 700 requests for help went unmet in one day alone. As you all have heard today, anyone can be a victim of domestic violence, including members of our own families, our daughters, our sisters, our cousins, our mothers, anyone. We don't want to have to turn anyone away. We can clearly see the immediate results of this budget elimination. Programs are forced to reduce staff, cut services, and many will have to close their doors. More victims and their children will face life-threatening violence and not be able to find assistance. But the unforeseen long-term effects of these cuts are even bleaker. Domestic violence is related to so many other costly social ills. A budget elimination meant to reduce a deficit will only serve to pass a greater debt onto our children and grandchildren. For more than 30 years, domestic violence experts have worked to improve safety for victims. The unprecedented progress gained, however, is threatened by these painful budget cuts. We've made the investment and the promise to victims that we'll be there when they and their children need safety. Our services are helping to rebuild and save lives. Advocates have been trained and systems have been transformed to keep victims safe and hold perpetrators accountable. The evidence-based, fiscally sound safety net has been developed. We need steady resources to keep it in place. The federal government has made a firm commitment to victims of domestic violence. The American Reinvestment and Recovery Act of 2009 has invested $17 million in California victim services through the Violence Against Women Act. We have been working diligently with members of Congress to see an increase in the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, which is really the only federal dollars that go directly to supporting shelters. And we haven't seen an increase in that fund for over 10 years, so we're hoping that this is our magic year for that. We're also, of course, working hard with Congress to see an increase in the Violence Against Women Act this next year. But federal funding is just one piece of the needed support to ensure that victims get the vital services they need. An investment today will result in long-term savings, both saving lives and saving dollars. We need the state of California to stand with us. We need lawmakers on both sides of the aisle to stand with us against domestic violence. Please restore this life-saving investment. Thank you.
Thank you. And in the Assembly, we did pass SB 13-3X on a bipartisan basis, which was very encouraging. We needed the 2/3, and hopefully next week when the Senate comes back, we will also be successful getting it out of the Senate. So thank you, ladies, for all the work you're doing. Okay.
I just wanted to make one more note that the programs, I think it's very important to note that the programs that we're talking about, not all the domestic violence programs and shelters in California, number one, are receiving state funding, and number two, not all of them are receiving federal funding. So I think that's important to note, and hopefully some of those folks are here today to provide some public comment.
And without further ado, public comments. Why don't we give about 2 minutes for people to give their public testimony, and if you just want to come up to the front and just state your name, come on up. Thank you very much for all coming.
Thank you. My name is Leo Rodriguez. I live in Sacramento. It seems very obvious that this is the kind of front-end money that prevents more visits to emergency rooms, more law enforcement issues, more dropouts, and more incarceration by victims and others in the penal system. This is an issue that you have to find the money, even though the short-sighted governor decided to pencil it out. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Crystal Fernandez, and I live in Fresno. I'm a social worker for Centro La Familia Advocacy Services. We're a nonprofit organization located in Fresno. I want to share with all of you why I think it's important that programs that support victims of domestic violence are critical. Under Senate Bill 1569, I work closely with domestic violence victims and their children, assisting them in obtaining a temporary restraining order against their abusers. In this process, we assist with many other services victims may need in order to establish some sense of stability for themselves and their families. We serve clients throughout Fresno County, specifically the ones in rural areas where services are scarce due to isolation, language, and transportation issues. Victims of this crime need so much help at this moment, as they often don't know where to turn, as their world has turned upside down. As we help victims, we can see the confusion and fear in the eyes of their children, as they look at their mother wondering what's happening, why is she crying, why is her face looking different. For clients living in rural areas, accessing services oftentimes is a challenge, and that's what we're here for, to help them access other services they might need, such as food, shelter, employment training, just to mention a few. We partner with agencies in rural areas throughout Fresno County and station staff at different locations to provide assistance to domestic violence victims in getting their temporary restraining order paperwork completed, since they don't have the means for transportation to Fresno, where most of the services are available. We help victims understand the court process in a language and terms they're able to understand, accompany them to court to provide comfort and support, and to let them know that they're not alone and that someone's cared for what has happened to them. Other huge barriers that our clients face are isolation and intimidation from their abusers. Their abusers use this power and control mechanism to threaten victims about their immigration status. This is just to mention some of the barriers that will bind victims to live in silence. That's why it's so crucial to keep our shelters and nonprofits going, because organizations like ours and others present here are victims' only means to seek some kind of help. We are the only escape to a life with more dignity, not only for themselves but for their children, who are our soon-to-come future. And I really believe that world peace truly starts at home.
Neil DeVal Morris, executive director of My Sister's House, and I just want to make sure that the needs of immigrant victims are addressed. And I know that you know this, Assemblymember Ma, but for the public record, 12.5% of California's population are Asian Pacific Islanders. And according to the U.S. Census, California is the state with the largest Asian Pacific Islander population. According to the Asian Pacific Islander Health Forum, 40 to 60% of Asian Pacific Islander women report experiencing domestic violence in their lifetime. There are only 5 domestic violence shelters specifically dedicated to providing culturally competent services in California to Asian Pacific Islander women. My Sister's House is the only shelter serving the Central Valley area with just 6 beds. Additionally, according to the National Association of Asian Pacific Women's Forum, Asian Pacific Islander women are the largest group of human trafficking victims. Family violence and internet brides are huge issues for Asian Pacific Islander women. As budget cuts are made, budget makers and policymakers of all levels should remember that the silent victims, those that are silenced not only by the languages of violence, but by their language of culture and their primary language. Why should there be culturally sensitive and appropriate organizations? From outreach to service delivery, organizations that have to target audiences, whether it be a special needs group or a general population. When that organization's focus is the general population, there are special needs victims that become neglected and are quick to be axed in terms of programs. Domestic violence victims that feel unwelcome will not stay and therefore not benefit from services. And the cycle of violence will unfortunately continue, affecting future generations. In summary, budget cuts will mean that it will be more difficult for culturally appropriate and sensitive services to be provided to ethnic groups like Asian Pacific Islander women, that mainstream organizations will have less capacity to serve them, and specifically, ethnic domestic violence organizations will also face the impact of the budget, including the fiercer competition for the resources and those receiving additional demand of services from non-API domestic violence survivors whom we also serve. So, thank you.
Laura Segura, Executive Director, Women's Crisis Support Defensa de Mujeres in Santa Cruz County. We closed our offices today, and 13 of us drove 3+ hours to be here to honor and advocate for victims of domestic violence and the 6 shelters that have had to close due to the governor's elimination of funding. Our agency has a 32-year history in Santa Cruz County, and we're very proud of the 32 years of hard work advocating for victims of domestic violence, specifically women and children. The governor's action to eliminate funding has set us back 35 years. As Victor Rivas said, let's not forget where we were. Let's go back to what it was like before our agencies existed. We can never go back to that, ever. So here we are today, fighting for our funding and for our services, just as our leaders did 35 years ago. Today, we are now forced to close our offices on Fridays, eliminate children's programs, including crisis intervention programs, prevention programs, and help with restraining orders, which are all very critical services to help victims get out of abusive relationships and to help prevent those to begin with. We are also forced to lay off advocates. In fact, we have several advocates here today who are here to show their support and their dedication to this movement, and tomorrow's their last day. So I want to personally thank them for being here today, and I want to honor their work, their tireless work. And in the DV field. Our DV field is in crisis. We need your help to save resources, to save those services. Thousands of women, men, and children are counting on us, and we're counting on you, so please don't let us down. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Joanne De Los Reyes Hilario. I'd like to thank you, committee, Assembly member, for being here. I'm the programs director for Women's Crisis Support Defensa, and Laura really had a lot of what I had written down to say as well. I feel like we're preaching to the choir here. I look around the room, a lot of these people I've seen working in the field. I've been doing this work for 13 years. There's a lot of people here that are here because they're passionate for it. I feel like the work needs to happen out there. We need to knock on those Republicans' doors and get them out here. What this cut means to us, Laura went over that in terms of what we're losing. It's been a minimum 20% cut for our staff, the layoff of 5 staff, all direct client service staff. And when I hear about re-stimulus funds, when I hear about reinvestment funds, our clients need those funds. Our DV agencies need those funds. We're finding that we ourselves are going to places like Healthy Families, the food banks, places we would usually be referring our own clients to. With these 5 staff cuts, we've had to reduce or eliminate vital services. One of the major reductions was to a children and youth advocate position, where we're educating them about what healthy relationships look like as they're growing up, letting them know what it looks like to be in a healthy relationship, and what they've experienced or witnessed at home isn't healthy. And I agree with Mr. Victor Rivers, losing the opportunity to educate children is a sure way to increase our future prison populations. Again, I want to thank you for your commitment to domestic violence services. I want to thank the CPEDV for taking the leadership in organizing this, and you for also taking the leadership in organizing this. And I feel that if this bill does not get passed on the 13th, we need to do more. We need to be out on the streets. We need to do more. And it's obvious by our commitment of our staff being on the road at 7:30 this morning that we're committed, and we would love to do whatever we can as well. And lastly, if the staff of Women's Crisis Support Defensa could please stand up. All of you with the purple shirts, I want to give you a big hand. And all the other domestic violence agency workers that are here, I know there are advocates out there. Rodney Clark was out there. Ralph Johnson, thank you. And we're all in this together.
Thank you. And you did touch about You talked about healthy relationships, and at our last Domestic Violence Select Committee hearing in San Francisco, one of the experts talked about that. They said, how do kids or, school-age kids know what a healthy relationship is when all they know is what they've seen at home? And that's also a challenge for us, and things to think about is we're working on education and courses. Maybe we need to do more to teach what a healthy relationship is. So thank you for bringing that up.
Hello, my name is Maria Campos, and I'm an advocate with the Women's Crisis Support Defensa de Mujeres in the Santa Cruz County. Well, according to the American Bar Association, the most recent statistics is that there's 1.3 million women, 135,000 men are physically assaulted by the intimate partners annually in the United States. This proves that domestic violence is not happening only in California, where the funds had been eliminated. Slightly more than half of these female victims of domestic violence live with children under the age of 12. The meaning of this is that these children will never get services due to the mothers not have the place where they can get the information and education of domestic violence effects on children. The statistics show that children who had been exposed to domestic violence suffer symptoms of PTSD, such as bedwetting, nightmares, and they are at greater risk of having allergies, asthma, gastrointestinal problems, headaches, and flu. All this could be the results of more women and children in the mental health system, and a lot of them, will cost more to the system than what they could provide to provide the services. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to be here today.
My name is Mary Weiberg, and I'm Executive Director of the State of California Commission on the Status of Women. I, too, would like to thank you, Assemblywoman Ma, and the Select Committee for holding this hearing today. I think the most important testimony is the testimony you've already heard, and I want to commend all of you who've spoken today and the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence for the strong advocacy work they have done on this issue along with you. What's been made clear is that there is a complicated interface between domestic violence and many state systems. They include the domestic violence programs, CalWORKS, law enforcement, prisons, juvenile justice, family law courts, foster care, health care, education, and housing programs. Long-term, the cumulative costs to the state of California and its taxpayers are not proactively addressing domestic violence through prevention programs and services far outweigh any budget savings through the cuts that have been made. The data shows that, if anything, the funding should be increased, and the Commission on the Status of Women is in full support of both reinstating and increasing funding to address domestic violence in the state of California. Thank you.
So I would like to take this opportunity at this moment to thank my staff, Gina and Justin, who have been working very hard on putting together these packets, which are available, that talks more about domestic violence, has statistics and other resources. Anthony Pico is here, Nick Hardiman, Eric Dang, Patty Shapiro, and Carolina and Mao, who is our consultant to the chair, this select committee, who is out on maternity leave, but many of you have had the opportunity to work with Mao, and she will be back. Also outside, the members of the select committee, their contact information is on pink sheets. I would encourage you to invite the members to your facilities all around the state. I know you're here from all around the state, and just talk to them about all the things that you are doing in their community, in their districts. I know all of them really do care about it. And to all the speakers here today, and the people who came up to testify, and also the public speakers, I think it was very clear from our first speakers, Victor Rivas Rivers and Melanie Magruder, of a time when there were not domestic violence shelters, there was not counseling, advocacy, legal, medical services for victims of domestic violence, and we don't want to go back to that time. And so we need the funding restored. We need to urge the governor, we need to urge the Senate to pass SB 133X to make sure it gets there. We also want to make sure that we develop a continuing funding source. There are more needs out in the community than there are funding resources currently, and it is very fragile, as we heard from one of the speakers. So what can we do to create a new funding source to make sure that we are able to help more women, more men, more families out there in crisis? So thank you all for fighting the good fight. Keep up the good work. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. It's our opportunity to educate the public, but we do need to do more on this front. So again, thank you. We will stand with you and fight this fight. So thank you.